Okay, so let's dive into a really specific and I think pretty fascinating source today. We've got these excerpts from a YouTube video transcript. It's someone sharing their perspective right from Tel Aviv, Israel.
That's right. And it's interesting because the source gives us these observations, these reflections, while they're actually like walking along the beach there. So it's a very specific viewpoint on current events in the Middle East and how they see them connecting to, well, global affairs.
Exactly. And our mission here, just to be clear, is really to unpack the key nuggets, the specific arguments, the observations only from the source material. We're just exploring what the source says, helping you understand this particular perspective without adding any outside info.
Okay, so getting into it, the source sets the scene immediately. Puts you right there, Tel Aviv. The Mediterranean Sea, the beach, that boardwalk heading down towards Jaffa.
Yeah, but right away, there's this contrast they draw, isn't there? The source notes, Gaza's on the same coast, and they claim Gazans had similar access before, but shows, and this is the source's phrase, a genocidal mission instead.
Mm-hmm. And despite the war, the atmosphere the source describes is, well, pretty vibrant, alive even. They talk about life going on, hearing music, people enjoying food. It sounds quite lively.
It does, but then there's the other side,
Yeah.
the reality of the military situation. The source mentions seeing men on the beach thinking they've likely served in Gaza recently, even noting showing injuries like limping. It's woven into the scene.
Right. Then the source shifts a bit. They talk about waking up there in Tel Aviv and checking news from the U.S., and this sparks a connection for them.
Yeah, they bring up this specific event described as a horrific situation in Colorado.
Good.
According to the source, it involved someone they describe as an illegal immigrant from Egypt who reportedly set people on fire while screaming, "Free Palestine!"
And the source really emphasizes this point, hearing that specific news felt, quote, particularly bizarre to them, being physically in Israel right then.
Mm-hmm. And they link that Colorado incident in their narrative to another recent U.S. event, the shooting at the Israeli embassy, which they say happened a couple of weeks before.
So based on these events and hearing certain phrases being used, the source offers their interpretation. They argue that phrases like globalize the intifada and river to the sea, well, they're understood by those using them, the source claims, to mean killing people.
Okay, and maybe just a quick clarification point there. The phrase river to the sea itself typically refers geographically, right? The land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. So what our source is doing here is presenting their specific take on the intent behind the phrase, based on what they've seen and heard.
Exactly. It's their interpretation of the intent. Now, the source also brings in another experience they had just before Israel, a trip to Hungary.
Oh, right, they went to CPAC there.
Yeah?
And met Viktor Orban?
Yeah, that's what they mentioned. And they use this Hungarian trip to draw a parallel. The source describes both Hungary and Israel as, pretty small countries. Hungary under 10 million, Israel around 10 million. And the source sees them both as really focused on protecting their borders, their way of life.
And they give that specific detail about Hungary, don't they? Paying that huge daily fine to the EU, 1 million euros a day. The source presents that very directly as, like, the price Hungary pays for closed borders. For sovereignty, as they frame it.
Mm-hmm. The cost of sovereignty. Okay, so back to Tel Aviv. The source talks about the diversity they observe just walking around.
Yeah, they list quite a few groups, seeing Muslims specifically mentioning 2 Muslim girls in traditional clothing speaking Hebrew. Also Jews, Baha'i, atheists, Christians. And the source describes them all living peacefully together there.
And that observation leads the source to make a pretty strong claim. They assert Israel is the only place in the Middle East. They do sort of nod towards the UAE maybe being on its way, but the only place that really has what they call progressive ideals, like tolerance and diversity.
Right. And then comes the twist or the contrast from the source's point of view. They find it surprising, or maybe ironic, that the modern left, or progressives as they put it, seem to, quote, hate the most.
Oh.
The very place that, in their view, actually embodies those progressive ideals.
Interesting point they make there. Now, across all this diversity, different political views, the source says they heard one thing pretty much universally in Israel from everyone they talked to, different ages, genders, politics.
And that was Epil Hostempe.
Insensitivity.
Hmm.
They just want the hostages back. That's the core sentiment the source picked up on.
Okay. So according to the source, it's not that Israelis necessarily want war with Palestinians, but getting the hostages back is the absolute top priority, non-negotiable.
That's the sense they convey. The source even mentions this hypothetical idea they heard or thought about building the tallest wall ever around Gaza, almost like get the hostages back first, then figure out containment. That kind of thinking.
Wow. And the source really tries to bring the hostage situation to life, doesn't it? With some very specific, very difficult details from what they saw and heard, especially at this place they call Hostage Square.
Yeah, Hostage Square. Describe it as this place where people gather daily. There are speeches, music, and really potent symbols, like a burned-out car, apparently for the October 7th attack displayed there.
And the anecdotes, they recount some specific stories, allegedly from former hostages or about them. There's the story about the Bias brothers, horrific. Allegedly, Hamas told them they were being released, but then released them in coffins. The source calls it a sadistic, twisted thing.
Mhm. And details from a female hostage's reported experience. Things like lice, drinking only a capful of water a day sometimes, eating moldy food, being forced to cook for captors. And this awful detail about surgery without anesthesia because the captors apparently prefer them alive and being told they'd be shot if rescue was attempted.
Just harrowing.
Okay.
And the source adds this observation, either their own or one relayed to them about the captors, an alleged glee they showed about having Jewish hostages.
Yeah, very disturbing elements reported there. Then the source shifts towards history. They present a very specific historical narrative about the region.
Right. They state it pretty bluntly. There never was a country of Palestine. That's the claim. Instead, they say it was the British Mandate of Palestine, part of the British Empire, and before that, the Ottoman Empire.
And they try to back this up with examples. The source mentioned seeing New York Times headlines from the 30s, saying these headlines showed Arab countries boycotting Palestine specifically because Jews lived there. They also bring up a coin, a Palestine coin from the 1930s, that the source says had Hebrew text on it.
Okay. And another historical point they make relates to the British partition plan. The source says it offered land to both Jews and Arabs, but claims that people identifying as Palestinians didn't really exist as a distinct group at that time. That's their historical interpretation.
And bringing it to the present, demographically speaking, the source states that Israeli Arabs make up 20% of Israel's population. They assert these citizens have complete equal rights, can vote, and flatly state there's no apartheid, though they do acknowledge what they term disputed territories in Judea and Samaria.
So taking the observations, the historical claims, the source then lays out Israel's rationale for the current conflict as they see it.
Right, and it's framed as the most righteous reason possible, which, according to the source, is retrieving its citizens, getting the hostages back. They give their estimated numbers again, 20 living hostages and about 60 bodies they aim to recover.
And the source is quite critical of some European leaders, isn't it? I'm mentioning Macron, leaders in the UK. They perceive them as pressuring Israel to stop fighting. And the source frames this pressure very specifically.
Yeah, they frame it as those leaders basically using Israel as a distraction, a way to deflect from their own internal issues, which the source describes as dealing with jihadists in places like Paris and the UK. Essentially, the source claims these leaders are throwing Israel under the bus to buy themselves some breathing room at home.
And that connects back to their earlier point about Hungary, right? Reiterating that view that every country has this fundamental right to defend its borders and its people.
Exactly. Which leads us to, I think, the source's core argument, their sort of central thesis about the bigger picture.
Which is?
That Israel is ground zero. They call it the tip of the spear for what they see as worldwide jihad and also what they perceive as this alliance between Marxism, progressivism, and jihad.
Wow, okay. And they argue that the kinds of attacks Israel has faced historically, they mention stabbings in Jaffa, suicide bombings from the past, that these things are now being seen more and more in Europe and the U.S. The source insists these things are deeply connected.
Deeply connected. So from the source's perspective, the stakes in Israel are much, much bigger than just Israel itself.
How so? What are the broader implications they see?
Well, the view presented is that if Israel were to fall, it wouldn't just be about the Jewish people. It would be, quote, game on for everybody. So they frame Israel's fight as fundamentally a fight for freedom and liberty for all of Western civilization.
And they contrast that with their view of Europe.
Right, which the source describes as sleepwalking into a slow death, seemingly unable to defend themselves. A stark contrast in their view.
Okay. And the source wraps up with a very direct, maybe provocative suggestion aimed at people chanting "River to the Sea" and wanting the war to end.
Yeah, it's a direct challenge, the source says. Instead of chanting "River to the Sea," instead of doing things like what they claim is happening, like locking Jewish students from entering campus, channel that energy differently. Chant, "Release the hostages."
And the claim is
What?
that doing so would actually end the conflict.
That's the assertion. The source states very directly, if you get the hostages released, it all ends. That's their view on the key.
And one final, pretty controversial point the source makes.
Yes. They assert that people chanting Free Palestine, or even leaders of Arab countries they specifically name Egypt, don't actually love the Palestinians or Gazans. And they point to Egypt's not opening its border crossing on October 8th as their evidence for this claim.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this deep dive into this specific perspective from Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
We've really walked through the arguments presented in this one source, this historical claims made, the details about the hostage situation as described, the connections drawn to global events, the defensive borders, all as framed by this source.
Yeah, and it's crucial, like we said at the start, to remember our focus here was only on extracting and presenting the points and arguments made within this source material. Just give you a clear picture of this particular viewpoint.
Absolutely. And we'll leave you with that final kind of provocative thought from the source. The perspective that Israel's fight isn't just for its own survival, but in a way for all of our existences. Definitely something to think about, reflecting on this unique viewpoint presented in the source.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.